Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. Now, you're in for a special treat tonight as we have the opportunity to hear about the history of Pilsner from author Tom Acitelli and his recent book, Pilsner, How the Beer of Kings Changed the World. We're going to experience a guided tasting of 4 different lagers and hear the history of these beers. So let's briefly meet. Tom is the author of Pilsner, also the Audacity of Hops, Whiskey Business, and American Wine. And the American Wine book was a finalist for the James Beard Award for the best book in 2015 and was one of the 5 wine books that the New York Times singled out for review that year. So that's a pretty prestigious thing. Tom has written about alcohol for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Eater, and among many others. And he was also the history columnist for several years at All About Beer magazine. He lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So welcome, Tom. I've been looking forward to this for some time. Could you briefly introduce what you're going to cover in our program regarding Pilsner, past, present, and future?
Thank you, Doug. Thank you very much. Imagine a beer style that changed the world. That's Pilsner, and that's what I know about.
Pilsner has a fascinating history. I mean, it really does, especially considering it's now the most popular beer style in the world. But Tom, when it came out, that was a tremendous paradigm shift to everybody around, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed, Doug. It sure was. I first want to thank you for having me and for everyone tuning in. I spent more than 3 years researching and writing Pilsner, How the Beer of Kings Changed the World. So it's a privilege to be able to talk at length about it and the style. Indeed, when it debuted in late 1842 in Bohemia, in what's now in the western part of the Czech Republic or Czechia, back then it was part of the Austrian Empire. It was sort of it was far from cosmopolitan Vienna and was kind of a country rural area. And Pilsen was the major city. But when I say major, it maybe had 30 to 40,000 people in the immediate area. And up until that point, beer in general had been 2 things. It had been mostly ales, which are heavier. We're all familiar with ales, heavier tasting. And number 2, darker. Right. Only in the few decades preceding the early 1840s had beer become lighter. And by what I mean by lighter is reddish or amber. Think of pale ales, or think of a Vienna lager like Samuel Adams' Boston Lager. So not golden, not the color of sunshine, not the color of straw, but just simply lighter, but not golden. Right. So that was beer. By then it was darker, it was heavier, and I should also mention it was generally pretty strong. So then Pilsner comes along.
As much a shock as Clear Coke. Do you remember when Clear Coke?
Oh, I do. Clear Pepsi. Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, something like that. But I just want to set the stage for people in the sort of the beer world. If you were, an adult in 1842 and you were a consumer, and chances are if you were in Central Europe or the United States or much of North America, you were a beer consumer. Beer to you was a sort of reddish brown to dark, right? Guinness was was probably the best-selling beer in the world. It basically followed the British Empire wherever it went. There was no inkling of a sort of golden beer or the sunshiny colored beers and the lighter beers that we know today. It just would not have been on your radar. You would not have been familiar with it. You wouldn't have had the context for understanding it. Obviously they didn't have the internet back then. So, or any sort of widespread research, and most people didn't travel more than 10 miles from where they were born. So it's late 1842 in this relatively remote area of the Austrian Empire, which covered much of Central Europe and Northern Europe then. And I just want to set the picture before we get to Pilsner Urquell, and you're welcome to open them now if you want, if you can't wait. But basically, the burghers or sort of elders or the aristocrats of Pilsen in Bohemia, who held the rights to brew and sell beer locally. Okay, it's very lucrative. I mean, back then, as now, Czech culture and German culture, It's a lot of beer drinking. It was a very lucrative thing to have. But these burghers in Pilsen were facing stiff competition from these sort of lighter colored, lighter tasting beers over the border in Bavaria, which was then its own country and now comprises much of southern Germany. So, what were these beers in Bavaria? They were lagers, first of all, so they weren't ales. And they were lighter in color. But when I say lighter, again, I mean reddish brown. But they were different. They tasted lighter. They were crisper. They didn't have the sort of alcoholic kick that an ale had, that a pale ale out of Northern England had, or those, even today, the heavier beers you get out of Belgium or the Netherlands. So they were eating into the burger's cut. They didn't like it. They didn't like the competition. We like to look back now with hindsight and think that our favorite beer style was born out of some sort of sense of altruism or, desire for, just making people happy or spreading the joy of a great tasting beer. No, this was straight up business competition, and they wanted to undercut it as quickly as possible. So what happens? It's late 1842, or it's 1839 at this point. The local beer can't compete. It's just a poor quality. It's not matching these crisp, clean, refreshing lagers coming from over the border. So the burghers get together in Pilsen, and they basically put forward a manifesto. I mean, literally calling it a manifesto and saying, we are going to undercut these Germans coming in and taking our market share. We're going to build a brewery. We're going to borrow Bavarian techniques. We're going to borrow Bavarian know-how, and we're even going to hire a Bavarian brewmaster to make a lager to compete with these Bavarian lagers. And that's where you get Pilsner. And Pilsner Urquell is a descendant from that original brewery. It's still in the same spot in Pilsen, a beautiful place. When the pandemic's over, if you can, and if you really want a sort of a beer field trip, I would strongly suggest visiting Pilsen. You can fly into Prague, and it's about a 2-hour bus ride from the Prague airport. And it's very, it's very walkable and manageable as the city center. And of course, beer is a big part of the tourism. And basically every Pilsner Urquell you see in the world, well, not basically, it is produced at this one site in Pilsen. And they also have, I would strongly recommend if you go there, you can take a tour, and they have unpasteurized Pilsner Urquell from vats, big wooden vats. And I mean, it's quite incredible. And there's a couple restaurants in Pilsen that have the concession to sell this sort of just fresh, unadulterated beer. It's quite incredible.
So, Tom, the green screen I've got here is actually Pilsen.
I was going to say, it looks familiar, Doug.
And these are the caverns, as I understand it. Have you seen these caverns?
Yes, I've been down there. That's where they serve you the beer from tap, right from the tap.
Well, it looks like well worth making a trip for. I mean,
it's incredible.
Really cool.
Okay, so I'm going to get to Pilsner Urquell now. And so I hope I painted a picture of where the beer world is, right? It's bending toward lighter and crisper. It's bending toward lagers, but it's still very much an ale world. If you're cracking a beer in New York, Toronto, Berlin, wherever, Rome, it's invariably going to be heavier and darker. Okay? So, Pilsner Urquell is still made where Pilsner itself was born in late 1842. The beer is an approximation of the original, of course, but a close approximation according to all research. Pilsner Urquell roughly translates to genuine Pilsner, right? And that is a sort of feature of 19th century beer, especially out of Europe. It tends to take on the name of the place. Not so much here in the United States. Steam beer was, sometimes you see it called California steam, but it's usually just called steam. Cream ale was born in the United States, but it's not called, New York cream ale. So the color of this Pilsner Urquell, I want to discuss that. The most golden beer everyone had seen to that point in 1842 when it was first tapped in November of that year. This was the salient feature of Pilsner, the style, and Pilsner, the idea. It came along, and this is the main point. This is sort of the main point of the early part of my book. Pilsner picked a heck of a time to be born and a heck of a time to leave its home. And by a heck of a time to be born, what I mean is it came along when beer was sort of bending toward lagers, right? But it also came along at a time when technologies such as refrigeration, the railroads, the telegraph, roasting technology in the brewing industry itself, all of this stuff, the steamships across the Atlantic, all of this stuff was coming into play in that period of time, right? So it's if you're going to introduce anything, any product you're trying to sell, it's going to benefit from the technological advancements of that period. But Pilsner also benefited from another feature of that period in history. And this is what I really enjoyed recounting in the book. Europe was basically in a constant state of upheaval, beginning in the late 1840s, about 6 or 7 years after the birth of Pilsner. So you have revolutions and counter-revolutions and almost a constant state of war. That led to a lot of Czechs and Germans emigrating to the United States. There was as many as 1 million Germans relocated in the 1850s, for instance, to the U.S., many of them settling in the upper Midwest. We know the cities, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Chicago. And they brought with them their tastes and their customs, which included brewing and beer gardens and lighter lagers. So my point is, had Pilsner been born, Pilsner, if these events and these technologies and these innovations had not come along when they did in the late 1840s, the early 1850s, if that hadn't happened, Pilsner probably remains a curiosity, at least into the late 20th century when all the beer geeks rediscover it, like they've discovered so many other styles that seem to have disappeared. But as it was, Pilsner, bang, came along at the perfect time for it. And I would also note, this was also the period of the first time of mass production of glassware and glass bottles. And we'll get to that with our next beer with Budweiser. But Pilsner Urquell and Pilsner, any Pilsner you drink, looks great in a glass. It's got the thick head, it's golden, it's effervescent. So it played off of that as well. And had it not come along when glass was being mass produced for the first time in human history, who knows, right? I also want to talk about the Christmas of Pilsner Urquell. It was light and effervescent at a time when most beers were not only heavy, as I discussed, but also not bubbly at all. They might be downright flat. And, this is very important, Pilsner was mildly bitter. The reigning beers at the time were ales, and the reigning ales were pale ale and India pale ale. I think we all know the stories behind those, but just very quickly, pale ale was a result of changes in roasting technique in the late 18th century in northern England. It produced basically lighter colored beer, but one that was still pretty heavy. The English were late to discover hops. It just was not something they added to their beers. That was the Dutch. The Dutch were the innovators in that. And then the Belgians. The English were relatively late. I actually came across a story. The English saw hops generally in the 18th century as a medicinal thing. And one of King George III's top aides suggested that His Majesty, who was suffering from insomnia, sleep on a pillow full of hops, because it was seen as something, the smell of hops was seen as something that could aid your sleep.
I like that idea. My wife's having trouble sleeping. I might have to try that.
It's something else. But again, the English, they pick up on it, and they pick it up from the Dutch, and they start using lots of hops. And so the pale ales, and especially the India pale ales that they produce, are bitter by the standards of the day. But not Pilsner. Pilsner is a milder beer. It's a milder beer style. It's much more golden. And in that way, it is refreshing, I think, compared to many other styles. And I just want to stress again, if it had come along in any other period of time, other than the early 1840s in Europe at that time, I think it would have stayed a curiosity for well over a century.
So the immigration was really what fostered its growth.
Right. America was very much an ale. Okay, well, back up. America was very much a whiskey country.
Right, right.
And it was very much a hard, there's hard cider in the Northeast or New England where I am. It still is. But more or less, the tipple of the day in the early republic was whiskey and rot gut stuff. I mean, just not, some of it was probably quite good, but most of it was utilitarian. People used to get drunk. And the early Americans drank constantly. So that's one of the salient features of the country. I mean, John Adams, for instance, was said to drink a tankard of hard cider every morning in Braintree, Mass, and in Washington, D.C. Of course, he lived to be 90, so maybe he was doing something right. But
was beer kind of an affluent beverage? Because I know George Washington brewed beer. Travis Rupp has talked about that, and actually, we've got an upcoming live stream where he's going to be talking about that in October. So was that George was certainly affluent. So was beer more of an affluent beverage?
Yes, definitely. But the reigning beverage was whiskey, right? But what happens in the 1840s and the 1850s with the arrival of especially the Germans, they bring a different drinking culture to the United States, right? And this becomes very important in the story of Pilsner. Their beer is not, they don't necessarily drink to get drunk, okay? Right. On the same scale. It's more convivial. This is where you get the rise of beer gardens and taverns that are not basically grog houses. People actually sit and converse, or they sit outside, or they sit near them.
Now you're distinguishing grog houses from pubs?
I'm saying that basically the early American pubs were hot, crowded, and for drinking, right?
Okay.
The Germans bring a different approach of sort of sociability. And it changes things, right? It changes the views on alcohol and what alcohol could be. So it draws in curious people who say, well, what are they drinking? Oh, they're drinking lighter colored, lighter tasting lagers. And that's where Pilsner really, it has another fortuitous pivot, right? It seizes another moment in history where the Americans take to it, and they take to lagers in general. And by the 1870s, I would say, well, by the 1870s, sometimes in the late 1860s after the war, you start seeing ale just start to disappear from the country. The number of ale producers in different cities dwindles into the single digits. It's really incredible. And whiskey, too, gets
with the lager.
They could not compete with the popularity of the lager. And most lager producers were German-American brewers. And that gets us to our second beer. But I want to make clear, the Germans in the United States were looking to Europe. Huh?
I'm ready to pour our first beer.
Pour it. Let's go.
Well, why don't you talk about it? I'm going to switch to the label, and we can talk about what we've got here. So that's the Pilsner Urquell, and if I can keep this straight. So I'm looking at, March 31 of 21, so don't they have about a year's expiration date? Okay, so this is not all that old considering it's shipped in.
And you can see the 1842 stamped on the bottle, right?
Yep. I'm going to try and do a nice pour. And actually, I brought this glass back from Germany.
Oh, nice.
So this is an actual Pilsner Urquell glass that I would like to say they supplied me, but I picked it up in Germany about 15 or 20 years ago. Ain't gonna make a mess.
No, you're good. That's perfect pour, Doug. Well done. I'm looking in the chats, and there's people talking about hops as a sleep aid. I didn't know that.
I'll bring it up nice and close.
Perfect pour. Well done.
Well, I have practiced. Nice Pilsner Urquell logo. And look how nice and clear that is. I mean, it is brilliantly clear.
And think at a time, if you lived in a beer culture that did not know, like the lightest beer might have been reddish or amber, the color of like dried honey or something. And then something like this comes along. It was a sensation from the get-go, locally and then across the Austrian Empire. And then by the 1860s, it's making its way, basically all over the world, first in Europe and then in North America.
Tom, cheers.
Cheers. Salud.
And to everybody in the audience. I see there's a lot of beers being discussed there in the audience. So cheers to everybody in the audience. This is one of 4 we'll get to try tonight as Tom talks about them. So that's a serious head, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how will that compare to the other beers we're going to try?
Well, I don't think Budweiser and Miller Lite will be able to compete. That's no offense to them, but I think Yuengling Pilsner will have a better shot.
Well, it's nice. And it's 2-row Bavarian malt, right?
Yes.
So that's probably what's really contributing to it. I believe I could get a milk mustache from that thing. I mean, it is still going.
And the effervescence is as I discussed, is one of the big features.
So before I drink it down, I want everybody to see what this guy looks like. So that's still got almost 1 finger head. Mm-hmm. Probably had almost 2 fingers when I poured it. So, wow. And, behind me here is where those are actually barreled. Now, Tom, in their difference, they have vats and then they have barrels, right? So what's the difference between the vats and the barrels?
Well, I think the stuff that we're familiar with all over the world, like it's exported from Pilsen, is the stuff that comes from the vats. The barrels behind you, Doug, are the sort of unpasteurized, straight from the bottle, or straight from the barrel version.
So those will be Keller beers?
Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, I honestly have tried to describe in words what it tastes like and what it looks like. It looks like if you've ever had, cask ale, right? But it's not as thin as cask ale. It's like the head is like almost a cereal like texture, and it has a deeper taste, a malty taste. You've
been in these caverns, right? And the people at the end there are having a beer. Is that?
Yes, you're getting a pour from the tap. I think they give us 2, and there's a little tasting room off it, and then it deposits you near. I mean, you can then walk or very short Uber or cab ride to the middle of town. I mean, maybe 10 minutes if that. And like I said, there's a couple bars in the area that have the concession to sell that beer from the barrels. And, that should be a highlight of your trip. Because also I would note
you've
that...
You've done what I'm doing virtually, right? Having a Pilsner Urquell in the cavern?
I would note that the Czech Republic is not on the euro. So at least for the Americans and the Canadians on this broadcast... it's real. I mean, the exchange rate is very advantageous.
So Josh asks a great question. This comes up a lot. He says, do they acknowledge a discernible diacetyl level in Pilsner or Urquell?
I have not heard that. They're very cagey about the recipe. There's an insistence on the part of the brewery that what you're tasting now in 2020 is what you would have tasted in 1842. And that, by all accounts, is not true. But it does retain some of the characteristics. But the diacetyl, I mean, you definitely do get that sort of buttery popcorn taste. But they would not acknowledge that, no. But they would insist that it couldn't be the case because they wouldn't have had that sort of recognition in the 1840s.
I tried to get a confirmation on that very question from the brewery before our event. I didn't have any luck. But what I have heard discussed, which I think makes more sense than anything, is there possibly were some batches, maybe even years, that their packaging or brewing was not up to snuff, and that there was a non-trivial amount of the beer, but the belief of experts that I've talked to, again, this does not come from Pilsner Urquell. I'm trying to get that answer, and I hope I will. I'm going to guilt them into it, if nothing else. But is they don't think any brewer would intentionally brew in any diacetyl. That was pretty well.
I don't know if is that their position?
No, that is just discussion that I have heard.
No, I think a small amount is fine as long as you can control it, but then it can get out of hand, especially as you scale up. So, and they certainly scale up. I mean, they're not massive, but it's a large operation.
Well, anyway, I hope to get that answer, and I will let our group know when we do. But it is a phenomenal beer. I mean, it is incredible. So delicious. Am I making you jealous?
Yeah, a little bit. Sorry, folks. Somebody's saying, like Tom says, like Sam Adams, a little diacetyl is desired as long as it's not micro spoilage. That's for sure. That's for sure. And some of the conversation in there on your pillow comment, I don't know if Gary's really shooting straight with us or not, but he talks about actually sleeping on some pillows, I guess, with hops in them. So how about commenting on that, Gary? I mean, are you really doing that, or are you just having fun? He may take him a minute. We can go ahead if you'd like. Are we going to move on to Budweiser, or are we sure. No, I got a long entry for Budweiser, so we can start that. Obviously, is one of the best-selling beers of all time, and I'm sure everybody on the broadcast had no trouble finding it. But I do want to paint the picture of what it was like when it's a time-tested sleep aid, for sure. Sorry, I'm following along in the chat as well. So, yes, but it was interesting about hops. I mean, it was kind of for some breweries and some brewing cultures, hops were reluctantly embraced. It wasn't until really the 19th century that it became the universal additive to beer. And before that, of course, brewers added anything they could season with, roots, bark, sugars, herbs. I mean, just a bizarre assortment of flavoring in beer. And so that's why I think, people say they can recreate beer styles from, 200, 250 years ago. I think you could definitely, but it wouldn't be palatable to our modern taste. It just wouldn't taste like you would want beer to taste. Somebody mentioned George Washington earlier. There's a recipe at the New York Public Library of pumpkin beer recipe that he had. And it's basically, ground up pumpkin and a lot of maple or molasses. So it doesn't look like any modern beer recipe that we would know. But that was beer 225 to 30 years ago.
Well, this has been nice. This is a lot of fun, and I'm especially interested in the Pilsner Urquell part, but especially we're going to talk about Budweiser next. So if anybody's got one, we're going to pour it in just a moment, and I think it's a pretty dramatic departure from Pilsner Urquell, those that are tasting alongside with us. So we will go ahead.
Sorry, Doug. It is going to taste different. But I'm assuming everybody on this broadcast has tasted Budweiser at some point in their life.
It had been a while.
Yeah, it had been a while for me as well when I started doing Pilsner book.
My wife nearly passed out when she saw me buy a 12-pack.
I used to collect Bud points. That's maybe shows my age a bit, but used to get points for how much Bud you could buy. So, and then trade them in for different things. So.
We want to go ahead and pour that while you tell the story of Budweiser?
Yes, our next beer. One of the things that I hammer home throughout Pilsner, how the Beer of Kings changed the world, is that it came along at just the right time for it to be successful. It picked the perfect time to be born and the perfect time to leave home. That was particularly true in the late 19th century. As I discussed, technologies and innovations such as the railroad, mechanical refrigeration, the mass production of glass and glass bottles, and pasteurization furthered the rise of a lighter-colored, lighter-tasting beer style that looked great in a glass and was best served cold. One of those people who seized mightily on these innovations was a man named Adolphus Busch. He was a German immigrant with some means. His family owned vineyards and other property back in Germany, back in Hesse. And he eventually connected with another German entrepreneur, Eberhard Anheuser, who had come to control a struggling brewery in St. Louis. It was called simply the Bavarian Brewery. And it made lagers, though not too well. Anheuser himself didn't mind, as most of his money came from making soap and candles in St. Louis. Anheuser and Busch met through a brewing supply company that Busch co-owned. And Busch would wed Anheuser's daughter Lily in 1861, right before both of them incidentally joined a Union Army regiment in Missouri, made up almost entirely of German-American immigrants. So the rest, they say, as they say, is history. Busch led the rise of the Bavarian brewery and its change into Anheuser-Busch in the 1870s. And there's this new brewery signature product, one of the best-selling beers to this day, was a bubbly, exceedingly pale, lightly crisp, and relatively low in alcohol lager called Budweiser. It was inspired. Now, there's some dispute about the origins of the name and the idea, but there's basically two birth stories, two geneses of where Budweiser comes from. It was either inspired by a trip to Europe that Adolphus Busch's business partner Karl Conrad took, or by a trip to Europe that a fellow German St. Louis resident named Otto Ladmann took. The Conrad story is probably the likelier one. Conrad was a wine salesman in St. Louis who wanted to get in on the city's beer trade. And as I discussed earlier, this was a period when all ale producers were being swept out of cities because of lager's popularity. So Conrad, the wine salesman, no experience in brewing or the brewing industry, but he's friends with Busch. Conrad commissions his friend Busch to brew a beer based on a Pilsner that Conrad supposedly had at a monastery in Bohemia. Damascene Lightning Bolt Pilsner at the Vienna Expo in 1876, a little bit earlier than Conrad. Or actually, no, much earlier than that. I'm sorry, I forget. The Vienna Expo was, I think, in the 1860s. But again, the Conrad explanation for Budweiser makes more sense. Anyway, Conrad tells Busch about his experience having this lighter tasting beer style, this lighter colored beer style, this more effervescent one, and asks him, can you produce it for the American market? And Busch says, okay. Up to that point, he was producing sort of darker colored lagers. They were still light tasting compared to ales, but they were nothing like the Pilsners that were being produced.
Not this color.
Yes, not as golden at all. So I want to read a paragraph from my book. It talks about the global connectivity that was becoming so integral to brewing and to Pilsner's rise in particular, beginning in the 1870s. Budweiser debuts in 1876. But at that point, the beer and brewing world was already bending toward this style. Lighter, looked good in a glass, looked good in a bottle, didn't get people hammered. They could have a few and still be cogent. So this is from my book. If you want to start pouring or drinking, guys, or comment on your Budweisers, I'd love to hear any adjectives for your latest Budweiser.
I can't wait to pour it.
And I have some trivia at the end. About Budweiser, which is actually kind of, well, actually I don't want to give too much away because that might be the answer. The finished product, that is Budweiser, became the best-selling Pilsner beer of all time. And it still stands among the world's top handful of beers in terms of sales. Conrad and Busch named it after that small Bohemian city in the Austrian Empire called, and I'm going to screw this up, Batzeski Buschweiß, or Budweis in German, that neither Conrad nor Busch had ever visited, but that they knew from its reputation for making a slightly more golden-hued Pilsner than that from the original source in Pilsen. So already we have evidence of Pilsner spreading popularity, and not just as popular with consumers, but with other brewers. You know, brewing, any brewer you ask, or anybody who manages a brewery or it works, it's a capital-intensive business. It's not cheap to make beer, even if some beer tastes cheap. So the fact that they are throwing in their lot with this, it shows the sort of power and the influence that Pilsner was already enjoying only about 25 years after its birth. Oh, Keith says he's been to the Budweiser. Again, that knowledge might have come via the travels of Otto Ladman or of Conrad himself. And now I get to the point of two revolutionaries in brewing in the early 19th century. Much as travel had revolutionized brewing 50 years before, when men such as Anton Dreyer and Gabriel Sedlmayr, now Dreyer and Sedlmayr were influential in developing lighter-colored lagers and ales in their respective breweries in what's now Germany and Austria. They squirreled away the latest information in English brewing for use on the continent, particularly roasting technology. This sort of connectivity had done so again with the creation of Budweiser, the golden, crisp, effervescent lager that C. Conrad and Company introduced beginning in March 1876 was a marriage of European tradition and American disruption. And notice I said C. Conrad and Company, not Anheuser-Busch. Conrad owned it at the start, but he falls on financial hardship. Busch swoops in, gives him a cut, says, "I'll take your Budweiser for my brewery." Smart. And also, Eberhard Anheuser dies in 1879. So within 3 years, Busch has control of this fantastic brand and full control with his wife Lily of the Anheuser-Busch brewery. The late 1870s were very good to him. Busch would eventually buy the rights to produce and market Budweiser from Conrad. And Budweiser would, of course, grow and grow and grow and prove hugely influential, not just with beer, but with things as disparate as mass production, with marketing, with advertising, with sports. It cascaded from its origin in 1876 through the next century and a half.
And haven't I read that they perfected essentially mass distribution of foods,
Yes.
that they had rail cars that while they weren't refrigerated, they had ice staged.
Yes, they had ice stations along the railroads, right?
Yeah.
And so he has his own. Busch is very, what business schools will later teach is vertical integration. He's a pioneer of that. He's also a pioneer of mass production. One of the things I uncovered from the research of my book was that even Henry Ford was influenced by the breweries that he saw getting up and running in the 1880s and 1890s because they were able to assemble so much very relatively quickly of what's a complicated product. Okay, maybe not as complicated as putting together an automobile, but he was inspired by the mass production of these breweries and their techniques. But the real, as Doug said, the real game changer, I think, is the ability to produce it on a large scale, produce Budweiser, or Pabst, Frederick Pabst was starting up at the same time, produce these pilsners, and get them farther, and have them taste the same, and have them look the same, and have the packaging look the same, all over the place. This was a new thing in the beer world, in the world in general, and in the business world. So it proves this hugely influential product. And Busch, one of the who I came to believe he's one of the great business minds of all time, seized on every aspect. And it didn't hurt that he was open to new ideas, that he read French, so Louis Pasteur's research into preserving beer, preventing spoilage, that helped. He was open to ideas in agriculture in the U.S. and using 6-row barley instead of 2-row, which wasn't as readily available in North America. He embraced, using rice and corn because that broke up. 6-row can be clumpy, but adding these adjuncts can sort of thin it out and make it easier to use. And he was very, very good at marketing. And I want to this last point is where I get the title for the book. Adolphus Busch was trying to come up with a slogan for when his brewery started bottling Budweiser on a mass scale. They had bottling lines. Whereas a few years before, you had somebody, like us homebrewers do, you just sort of bottle the beer one at a time. Busch got the idea for the slogan for his new bottled Budweiser from an old Bohemian saying or slang regarding the original Pilsners. They were called the beer of kings. So Busch inverts it and says he's the king of bottled beers. Now, of course, his descendants in the late 20th century would get the trademark for king of beers and lose the bottle. but at the time it was king of bottled beers, and that was taken from the Bohemian slang of beer of kings.
And this was years before Coca-Cola, right?
Oh my gosh, yes. No, yes, easily. This was at the cusp of that sort of mass industrialization of food stuff in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and the U.S. was far ahead of the rest of the world in this, even far ahead of the U.K. And beer was at the vanguard. It doesn't get the credit I think that it deserves for the innovations that it spurred in business and in manufacturing in particular, but it does deserve it. These things were marvels at the time.
I mean, it pretty well was the first nationwide brand. You know, what we take for granted, nationwide brands,
yes.
that it was quite uncommon.
The only thing that maybe came close as far as the food stuff was Campbell's. Budweiser was up there, and so were I don't want to take away from Pabst, who was actually a bigger brewer than Adolphus at that point, and they would sort of define macro brewing or whatever you want to call it back then. Big business of beer in that period, much the same way that Busch and Miller would define it 100 years later.
So you didn't include PBR. Was there a reason for that?
And
in our tasting?
There's only so much I wanted to have people. Yeah. Anyway.
Wait, we could go on all night. What I hear.
Right. I love PBR, and that has a very interesting history and a rivalry with Budweiser. It's kind of fascinating. And what they went through at the Chicago Expo, which was in it's in the book, but they basically had it was like the last final showdown of Adolphus Busch and Frederick Pabst for like who's king of the world when it comes to beer, and it all came to a head, if you will, in Chicago, and basically that's where you get PBR, Pabst Blue Ribbon, is that Pabst claimed an award for his beer that really didn't exist, but he seized on it to sort of needle Busch. And Busch even went so far as to try to, sue him and get judges at the expo to overturn their decision. But their decision was basically that all the beers entered passed certain scientific benchmarks and were quality beers.
Eric says 1893 Chicago.
Yes, 1893.
Go, Eric.
Thank you very much.
Mike Brennan also is talking about diacetyl. And as we switch back to that just briefly, he was saying standard levels of diacetyl in most lagers in the world in 1969 was about 6 times higher than current.
Oh, my God.
It wasn't really
I did not know that.
An off flavor. So probably where some of that history of Pilsner Urquell comes from.
Yes, well, what you have in the 20th century, especially after World War II, is an even greater scaling up. And so there were corners cut, right? But I would hasten to add, there's a tendency in, I have this tendency too in craft beer to say, well, they bastardized everything, they ruined it. How could they? But really, at the time, Budweiser and these other beers post-World War II were responding to the marketplace. And people did want lighter, ever lighter tasting and lower alcohol beers. So it wasn't necessarily a sort of degradation of the style of Pilsner. It was a response to the market, in much the same way that the birth of Pilsner itself was a response to the competition from Bavarian lagers in the 1840s. So, thank you, Keith. I appreciate it. And the Vienna Expo was 20 years before. It was in 1873. And Pilsner sort of broke. I mean, it was a showcase of the Austrian Empire at that expo. And that's when it had sort of its biggest audience. At a time when these expos and these world fairs were, they were an opportunity that only came along so often to mass market something. And, the brewers took advantage of that.
So you want to open the Miller Lite?
We hit the Miller Lite. Okay, here we go.
Well, that was a question. I'm not trying to pace you.
I think Miller Lite is actually a good segue because what we've done so far is set up Pilsner, as a style and as a commercial draw and a draw for brewers, right? So we're into the 20th century. It survives. This is all in the book, and it's just a fascinating social history and business history. Basically, fine Pilsner. See, I got the idea for the book. I don't know if anybody remembers, but about 5 years ago, Miller put out the original, like, classic Miller Lite cans and bottles from 1975 when it was introduced. And I saw that, a fine Pilsner beer. And my last book on beer was The Audacity of Hops, which was a history of the craft beer movement from the early 60s onward. And I was looking for another beer book idea, and I thought, well, maybe I could do a prequel to Audacity of Hops, which is about craft beer. But then I thought, it's just going to be a history of beer to that point, to 1964, 65. What can I shape it around? What can animate it? And so I saw that. I saw those bottles and cans from Miller, the classic. Like, you remember the commercials from the Super Bowl in 1981 or 82. And I thought, yeah, bingo, Pilsner. It is, we'll get to this later, but it was the reigning style for so long before craft beer came along. So I want to, so now we're in the 20th century, in the late 20th century. Pilsner dominates, survives Prohibition. It survives the wars, World War I in particular. You wouldn't think, but World War I in particular was really dicey for the style and for the brewers behind it. But it comes out of both. It comes out of rebuilding of the world after World War II, and it doesn't lose its place. If anything, the big story is on the business side as breweries consolidate. A ton of breweries go out of business. The world sort of gets divvied up like a big game of Risk between a handful of brewers. So, if there is one single beer that shows the muscle of Pilsner, that displays its raw power to shape and remake the global beer market in its image, it's this beer that the Miller Brewing Company introduced in 1975. There had been light beers before, but they had flopped commercially for one reason or the other. These are hilarious stories when you get into them. The breweries pushed the dieting angle, and who associates beer with losing weight? The beers were too watery and thin. The federal government didn't like breweries promoting any health benefits on alcohol packaging, including that bit about dieting. Thank you very much, Aaron. But along comes Miller Lite, and there's a backstory to Miller Lite that's just fascinating. It starts with the acquisition of Miller Brewing by Philip Morris, the tobacco giant, and they were looking to place it to sort of place it at the top with Anheuser-Busch, which was still at the time run by Adolphus Busch's descendants, to make it one of the biggest breweries in the world. So they were looking for an angle, and they were looking at a sloganeering. They were looking at reintroducing other brands. They weren't thinking in terms of a new beer or a new beer style, which some people consider light beer to be, but that's for another broadcast. But along comes Miller Lite.
Is that a commitment?
What's that? Sure.
Another program.
Oh, I could talk. Yeah, I could definitely talk about light beer. Some people, they insist that it's one of the few beer styles born in the United States. The others that are sort of beyond dispute are steam beer and cream ale. And there's a couple others you hear about, Kentucky Steam. But some people lump in light beer and that it's a distinct thing. And it's certainly true that light beer, as we understand it, as a segment of the market and a force in the market, was developed in the U.S. As what I say is modern light beer, because there were versions and iterations in northern Germany, but it's really in the U.S. where it takes off. Why did everything change with Miller Lite in 1975 if other brands had failed before it? Well, for one thing, Miller developed a formula, or actually had bought a formula that had been developed. A fascinating figure in Joseph Awades. He was a biochemist, and he had worked at Rheingold in Brooklyn and came up with a formula, basically with an enzyme that eats the starches and the sugars. And so you have a lighter tasting beer that still tastes like beer, but has less calories, fewer calories. Awades also gained fame about a decade later, 20 years later. He helped develop the recipe for Boston Lager, Samuel Adams, which of course became massively successful for craft. So they Miller develops a formula that doesn't reduce, it lowers the calorie count, but doesn't reduce the heft or the gravity of the beer. Because believe it or not, Miller Lite is a heavy-tasting beer by light beer standards. You can get some really watery ones. I don't know if anybody remembers Milwaukee's Best Light. I always hold that up as the example. Utica Club and a Saranac, that's a light beer, even if it doesn't say it, and it's near water. The second thing Miller Brewing did, and its ad agency, McCann Erickson out of New York, is they orchestrated a soft sell of the product that's centered more around ex-pro athletes and comedians than around whether or not it was low in calories. The brewery let its customers reach their own conclusions about the dietary aspects of a beer that Miller touted as, quote, everything you always wanted in a beer and less. So some people took that less to be the calories. Some people took that less to be, it didn't fill you up as much. They left it to the customer. They were selling the idea that this could be a beer substitute, even if it was lighter, right? And we can see that now, like how light it is. I wanted to read another paragraph from my book to show just what light beer did in terms of Pilsner's further growth in the last decades of the 20th century. So this is from Pilsner, How the Beer King. So this is from the book, just to show the power of light. The Pilsner itself and the marketing behind it, this is Miller Lite, paid off spectacularly for Miller. The brewery went from the 8th largest in the nation in 1970 to the 3rd largest within 24 months of the release of Miller Lite. Quote, a meteoric and unprecedented rise, according to the New York Times. Miller's production levels bounced 43% as the rest of the domestic brewing industries increased barely 2%. It was assumed that Miller would soon once and for all nudge Schlitz, or Pabst, remember them, or whatever other dowager from the number 2 spot and set up its long-awaited showdown with number 1, Anheuser-Busch. The pair were already gobbling up smaller competitors and expanding distribution deeper into more and more markets. The Times predicted in August 1977 that Anheuser-Busch and Miller would capture half the beer sales in the U.S. by the end of the decade, and then turn their respective forces on the globe, where each already had an expanding footprint. Pilsner was reaching farther and further than ever before behind this mounting rivalry. And I would add that that a lot of analysts and people in the industry back then were saying not only that AB and Miller would, would dominate the U.S. market, which turned out to be absolutely true, but that they would, by the end of the century, be the only 2 breweries left in the U.S. I mean, that was the smart money. That people who invested in beer or financed brewery developments for Anheuser-Busch and Miller, that's what they expected, right? That there would be 2 breweries left by the year 2000, maybe 3, maybe a third, maybe Schlitz hangs on or something like that. But really, it would come down. The American beer market would come down to a couple of names making a few dozen brands. Now, we all know that didn't happen, and that leads us to our final beer, which is Yuengling Pilsner, right, Doug? But, a lot of the story, sort of shifts to the United States. I do talk about its role in Italy, Southern Africa, South Africa in particular, Australia becomes very big. But really, it's the fact that it jumped in the 1850s to the United States. Without that, I don't think the Pilsner would have ascended the way it did. It really, it just picked that perfect moment. It soaked up the innovation, it soaked up the technology, and then the Germans and the Czechs just sort of loosed it upon the world, taking it wherever they went. Oh, and a blonde American lager, right? Don't they? Yeah. They do. There is a Guinness blonde or something like that, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm getting set up here.
Oh, sure.
I think, isn't that the Harp Lager?
No, there's something called Guinness Golden or something, but it's an ale, I think.
Okay, maybe somebody can look that one up for us.
Okay, Pilsner. Okay, so Yuengling Pilsner, right? Well, we all know Yuengling. I think it's the oldest operating brewery in the United States. It dates from the 1830s. The rise of Pilsner out of the mid-19th century in Central Europe defined the modern age of beer and brewing. Pilsner became the most popular style and spurred the biggest technological and marketing changes in the brewing industry, not least the isolation of yeast strains, pasteurization, bottling, and distribution. Never mind pretty much every beer ad, jingle, or slogan you can remember. But what is proving its most enduring effect, I think, and proves my thesis of its influence, is that there's a massive reaction to Pilsner's popularity, still unfolding. And that reaction is craft beer and craft brewing or microbrewing, whatever you want to call it these days. There's a long, fascinating history. I'll cut it short. Pilsner became so dominant, so ubiquitous by the mid-20th century that a not insignificant number of people began hunting voraciously for an alternative. I've had the pleasure to talk to many of these people. It's basically a counterculture in beer. Like we've had it with what's available where we live. We're going to turn to making it ourselves. We're going to turn to sharing information. And luckily for the world, there was a big tax cut in the mid-1970s on per barrel production of beer. There was a legalization of home brewing in 1970. Well, it was passed in 78, took effect in 79. And some people started turning pro, right? And that's where we get the first startup craft breweries. So styles that Pilsner's rise had basically swept away, IPA, pale ale, porter, cream ale, they begin to reappear, especially in the 1970s. A good part of the last one-third of my book is how Pilsner, which represents so much of macro or big beer, collided with craft beer. They sort of ran alongside each other until the 1990s, and then they collide. The competition from craft beer becomes too much for the big players to ignore, and they try to co-opt some of that market. Part of the collision involved ignoring or standing athwart Pilsner. How did craft brewers do that? But they resurrected those styles that had all but disappeared. But you also have, eventually, the embrace of Pilsner itself, right? Or, as I call it, the world can only drink so much IPA. Craft brewers in the 1990s start to reinterpret the very style that spawned their sector of the market, the reaction to it. And that's where we are today. Pilsner is coming full circle stylistically. Just as its originators 170 years ago sought to create something new and exciting, so too do the tinkerers in Pilsner today hope to do the same. And that's where you get Yuengling is best known for its lager, right? Its traditional amber lager, I believe it's called. A number of years making a Pilsner, they basically leaned on their lager, which is so, popular in southeastern Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania. If you order a lager there, you'll be brought a Yuengling. I've tried it. It's actually kind of hilarious. But they only recently, this is the Golden Pilsner we're going to have is maybe a few years, it's only a few years old, it's the brand. But it's a great example of the fact that smaller independent breweries are like, we have to get in on this, do our own interpretation of the style that we wanted to fight back against. And so they're they're now embracing Pilsner and reinterpreting it.
A news release Yuengling sent me was March 20th, 2018 is when they put out their release of the Golden Pilsner. So that is pretty recent. Well, we do have a short video. It's just like a minute long. It's kind of interesting.
And then I have some trivia, Doug.
You have some trivia? Okay, do you want to share that before the video?
No, we can do that after the video to end, and then I'll take any other questions. It's been fun.
Okay. It's about minute and a half long.
We tried everything from craft-style beers to domestics and imports, and we settled on something that we thought was uniquely Yuengling, and it really complements our core portfolio. I think for us it was an opportunity to make a beer that we could really throw ourselves into and something that we would really enjoy drinking. It's a golden Pilsner style beer, very drinkable, and it's the type of beer you can take with you on any occasion, whether you're going to the beach or you're hiking outdoors, and that's important to us because we have active lifestyles.
We looked at everything from the grain bill. It's an all malt brew, which tends to take away from some of the sweetness, so it leaves you with a drier finish. And we played with a lot of different varieties of hops. And we settled on some German noble hops, which leaves you a very subtle sort of hop bitterness, so it's not overpowering.
It's bright and refreshing, and hopefully that represents the crisp, smooth taste that you get from the liquid.
So Tom, I'm going to go ahead and pour this if that's okay.
Go for it. That's great.
All right.
You got the right glass for it, I see. That's good.
I do, but I thought what I'd do is look at the bottle first, and then we'll jump into the pour. Get my mug out of the picture. Sorry. So, Tom, you want to talk about it a little bit? As best you can?
Well, the main thing I would take away from this, from England Pilsner, is the fact that they jumped. They did, their main business is the traditional lager. They have a fantastic porter. I don't know if it's widely commercially available, but they had sort of shied away from doing a Pilsner. But I think it's something that a lot of craft brewers and small brewers are embracing, because they want to do they want to show that the style does not have to be what the bigger players say it is, and what they've been passing off as their interpretations of it for decades and decades. So I think it's an interesting sort of full circle. It's just the style of Pilsner. Pilsner stylistically has come full circle. It's still on the business side. It's about big business. It's about market share and share of throat, as the breweries put it. But on the style side, it's just getting more and more interesting. And of course, you get just like you get with pale ales and IPAs, you get things. You get interpretations of the style that just seem outrageous. So I have seen pale ale pilsners, or extra bitter pilsner, something like that. That is not necessarily representative of the style as it was known originally, or known for most of its life. But as so often is the case with craft brewing, the novelty of it is something that people pursue.
Well, it has some serious effervescence. But I'm disappointed, since it's all malt. I really expected more of a head. I
did too, actually. And the glass looks clean, so I don't.
Oh, yeah. I made sure it was beer clean. So
it's a good term.
I don't know. I have more I can try later, but yeah, I didn't get much of a head out of it, but that's okay. The clarity, I mean, it is brilliant. And I think there must be a nucleation point on the bottom of this glass, because I've never seen such bubbles coming off one. It is champagne-like. But the aroma's nice, bit malty, some nice kind of spicy hops.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice. Wow. Henry says he has to drive to drive east to find his. And fortunately, I was able to find some in the store, and then Yuengling was nice enough to send me this glass for our program. So I thought that was generous of them.
I'm in the Boston area. It's pretty easy to find. And I interviewed Dick Yuengling for the second edition of the Audacity of Hops, which came out in 2017. He was a great interview. It was really fascinating, because they came, not only did they embrace Pilsner in 2018, but they sort of came to the craft label later. They had, for a long time, just operated sort of in a middle netherworld between big beer and craft beer. And they sort of went over to the craft side about 10 years ago, which is a good thing for the industry.
Aren't they considered the largest craft brewery?
Yes. And that was one of the reasons they stayed out, was, I think, because they didn't need it. They didn't need to be known as craft to survive. They've been around since the 1830s. But I think the other part was the definition of craft at the time was a little narrower. So it's
Tom,
sort of
you keep
expanded.
talking, but I thought it might be fun to line these up.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to take it full screen, but you keep talking.
No, I was just going to get to that's fantastic. It's sort of like the evolution of Pilsner.
Yeah.
We started Pilsner Urquell, and we come through the 20th century.
That's the Miller. This is the Bud.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I probably need to adjust the focus a little bit. I've got something to put that mug on, so we'll bring him up a little bit so he doesn't look quite so dumpy. And we'll focus the cinema camera just a little bit. I'm sorry, that rocks a little bit when I touch it. That's a nice looking array of pretty beers, isn't it?
And there's still effervescence in the, still bubbliness there. Look, in the Pilsner Urquell.
Yeah. Not a lot. tiny little bit of head. You can get a little bit of a ring around it. But actually, the two that held the head the best seemed to be the Pilsner Urquell and the Miller Lite.
The Miller Lite. I'm quite stunned.
I am too. I was predicting that it would be the Pilsner Urquell and the Yuengling. So maybe the glass was not completely clean. I'm not sure what that is, but I have a few more to practice with, and I will report back. I'll consider that homework.
I just wanted to end with, I like doing this trivia questions. There's no prize, I apologize, except satisfaction, if that's a prize. So that first Pilsner, from what was then known as the Burgers Brewery and is now known as Pilsner Urquell, where was it first distributed in the United States in the mid-19th century? A, High Point, North Carolina. B, Brooklyn, New York. C, Racine, Wisconsin. Or D, Baltimore, Maryland.
I'll go with
you want
Wisconsin.
To take a stab? A, High Point.
Wisconsin.
You vote Wisconsin. B, Brooklyn. C, Racine. D, Baltimore. Oh, I like these comments about where to find you.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're going to get any takers.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go.
The answer is C. Racine, Wisconsin. There was a sizable Czech immigrant population in the Wisconsin city. And so when it came to distribute, yes, when it came to test this brand in the U.S., they were like, well, we'll go there. Last question. Okay.
That wasn't why I guessed it. I was thinking just access to the shipping, and already there was a lot of beer.
That's true. Well, I thought Brooklyn, New York, but anyway. It's Racine,
but I don't know
Wisconsin.
that there was as much brewing at that time, was there?
In Brooklyn?
Yeah.
It was on its way to being quite a bit of brewing. There, by the end of the century, there would have been, well, this was in the 1860s, so, yeah, I mean, Brooklyn would end the 19th century with about between 90 and 100 breweries. There was quite a few, because there was a big German population there, too, and you still see the signs of it in the center of the borough. And a lot of the smaller breweries there take advantage of that history and, talk it up and put themselves on the continuum of Brooklyn brewing.
Well, that was a fun question.
Okay, next question. The last one. In early 1973, Chicago Daily News columnist Mike Royko arranged what was probably the first taste test for beer in a major U.S. media outlet. Royko and his judges sampled 22 beers, most of them lagers. Which beer finished dead last? Was it A, Schlitz Genuine Gold, B, Budweiser, C, PBR, or D, Rheingold Extra Light? Schlitz Genuine Gold, Budweiser, PBR, or Rheingold Extra Light?
What was the first one?
Schlitz Genuine Gold.
That's my guess.
Next one is Budweiser, then PBR, then Rheingold Extra Light.
Let's see, we got A, B, D. That's all over the place. Oh, A's, I think, leading.
The answer is B, Budweiser. I made up the Schlitz. There was no such beer as Schlitz Genuine Gold, but that seems believable. Budweiser.
No, that's not fair, Tom.
I know. It was a trick question. But beers from Western Europe finished first and second, and a Pilsner from Stevens Point in Wisconsin was the highest-rated domestic selection in third place. And I would note when this was done in 1973, of course, Budweiser was the best-selling beer in the country. Yeah. But in a blind tasting, it was dead last.
Tom, is there a closing comment, and I'm going to show these beers again, that you'd like to make?
I would just like to reiterate that in my book, Pilsner, How the Beer of Kings Changed the World, that it really did. That it had a sort of a force that no beer style and no alcoholic beverage to that point had. And the ramifications of its quick rise continue today. I mean, we wouldn't be discussing this, we wouldn't be on this broadcast were it not for the birth and rise of Pilsner.
Well, and it's certainly been adapting for the past few months. Well, it is, we're almost an hour and 40 minutes into this, but what fun I know I've had. I hope everybody else has had a good time. We've had some delicious beer, all the way from the original Pilsner Urquell up to the very modern Yuengling Golden Pilsner. And I think it's been a lot of fun. I know, Tom, I've learned more about Pilsner than I knew, even from my Cicerone classes, so I appreciate that very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was a lot of fun.
Appreciate it, Doug. Thank you.
Well, it sounds like we need to do one on hops.
Certainly.
Gary Fuller says, another great presentation. Thanks, guys. And so I think with that, Tom, and Gary's comment there, we'll wrap this up. Michael says, excellent webcast tonight. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
And Tom does have a book. I have it here. It's a great book, by the way. And Tom, this is out, right?
Yes.
This wasn't like an early copy I got.
It's been out for about 3 weeks.
About 3 weeks. The link for Amazon in there. I don't think I can pop it in the chat, but it's an excellent book and a lot of fun. And Tom, if somebody has a question or wants to debate with you a little bit, is there a way they can get in contact with you?
Yeah, let me put my email in.
Perfect. Okay, so everybody sees it there in the chat. So contact Tom if you got some further questions on Pilsner. And Tom, we'll keep talking. Maybe we can do another one on another program sometime in the near future.
Fantastic. I hope so.
All right, coming up, I believe it is September 17th, we have Travis Rupp. And quite likely that will be our next program that we do. And Travis is going to be talking about the brewing in monasteries. And if you know who Travis is, we've already done one program with Travis. He is the beer archaeologist. He has some fascinating stories to tell. He is quite a difficult speaker to corner. So I'm excited to have him actually twice coming up. He's also going to touch base with us in October, where we're going to be talking about his Ales of Antiquity series, and we're going to be actually talking about the George Washington beer, as well as several others that were brewed in early America. So
that's fantastic.
Well, and I think even beers that were not necessarily brewed in early America.
One of the beer trips I took was I was just say one of the coolest beer trips I ever took was to visit the Trappist monasteries of Belgium, the breweries.
I have not done that yet. I made a lot of trips to Europe, but I have not made it to the monasteries. And so Henry says, great content. So Brad says, look forward to reading it. So Tom, great job. We enjoyed it. Audience, thank you very much. And looks like we lost Tom. So I think it is time to finish these beers. Bye-bye, everybody. Cheers.